Should it be illegal to be annoying? You might think it sounds like a good idea, and I can think of a few people, but
Honestly.
Pointing fingers, but could buskers, carol singers, or even, dare I say it, political interviewers fall foul of the law?
Again.
Well, members of the House of Lords were an annoyance to the government last night, more than that, I should think, when they defeated the plans to make causing nuisance and annoyance a criminal offence. Here's what peers had to say about it.
Nuisance or annoyance cannot, I would maintain, and should not, be applied to the countryside, to the public park, to shopping malls, sports grounds, the High Street, Parliament Square, Speaker's Corner and so on, because that risks it being used against any of us and against anyone in society. It risks it being used for those who seek to protest peacefully, noisy children in the street, street preachers, canvassers, carol singers, trick-or-treaters, church bell ringers, clay pigeon shooters, nudists. And yes, they too, my lords, have raised objections with me, and I know with other members of your lordship's house.
If people feel threatened and their lives are very badly impinged upon, that's what we are trying to prevent, or the government is trying to prevent by this bill. I don't want to downplay the impact of some bad behaviour on a lot of people.
I want to take you back to 1970s Soho, where as a young constable I was patrolling with a much more streetwise officer when we were approached by a rather large Westminster councillor who was objecting to people handing out leaflets about rent rises. And he said that he was really annoyed by this. And the officer I was with said, "Well, sir," he said, "my Aunt Mabel is annoying, but I'm not going to let anybody arrest her for just being annoying."
And with us now is the Home Office Minister, Norman Baker. Well, Norman Baker, it's an embarrassing defeat for the legislation, isn't it? Are you going to accept the wording that was suggested there? Harassment, alarm or distress, rather than nuisance and annoyance?
Well, it's disappointing, certainly, and to be honest with you, I despair having heard some of the Lord's comments, because
Why?
they're simply misinformed. It's not a criminal offence that's being proposed, it's a civil matter which is subject to the bill. There are tests of reasonableness put in there to make sure we don't have Aunt Mabel or whoever it is arrested, let alone carol singers.
But they're not convinced, are they, Norman Baker?
Well,
because otherwise they
no.
wouldn't... Well, I mean, that sounds like the government hasn't done its job properly. And even somebody from Liberal Democrat Voice said, a contributor, these laws will be used to stamp out plurality and difference, to douse the exuberance of youth, to pursue children for the crime of being young and together in a public place. Not very liberal.
They won't be used for that. They can't be used for that.
Why can't they?
Because there are safeguards in place about a reasonableness test, because you have to go to the courts for the courts to uphold any application for an injunction. There are amendments in the bill which I've put down with my colleague John Taylor and the Lords, which specifically protect, for example, political protest. This is not the end of civilization, as some people are presenting it.
But they think it is. I mean, nuisance and annoyance is a very elastic, or they are very elastic terms. One person's nuisance, Norman Baker, you must accept, would be another person's exuberance.
Yes, but I've said to you, they have to be. That's constrained by the tests which are in there. It has to be just. It has to be reasonable, and the courts have to agree.
But why change the wording in the first place? What was wrong with it?
Words.
Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you why. Because we're moving away from Labour's failed ASBO process, where people continually re-offend despite the ASBO being given to them, moving to a civil standard, which is much better in terms of not criminalising young people, and an attempt to deal both with that and with antisocial behaviour at the same time. It's a better package.
Do you think it's a better package? Do you think that we need this legislation?
Oh, it's quite. I mean, it's very silly for this to be built around words like annoyance and nuisance. I mean, this is, you just gone to the wrong part of the dictionary, I have to say. I mean, these are words that we cannot make subject to any sort of legislative stuff. We will keep on hearing about Ben Williams. We will keep on hearing about Aunt Mabel's, and unless we get rid of these words and actually make something a little bit more objective, then it's silly. It's just dead silly.
Are you going to get rid of the words?
We're going to look at what the laws have said. Of course we are. But let me just stress, it's not a criminal offence we're introducing. Secondly, this is an injunction which a court would have to grant. So the idea that carol singers, for example, can be stopped by this is complete ludicrous nonsense. The carol singers will be 5 miles down the road before the court's even met.
Right, you say it's not a criminal offence, but what could happen? I mean, some of the... Lord Blair, two very experienced police officers, both said it's an awful piece of legislation, we should seek to avoid it. And they say that you can end up in a court, you could end up having some sort of sentence.
No, I mean the only.
Can you not?
No,
Whatever happens.
If you breach an injunction subsequently, then that takes it back to the court. But that's the only way you can get there. Look, this is a wider problem. Whenever someone like 30 Degrees or some unelected body says the government's planning to kill every 10th child, nobody says that's nonsense. They say they write to people like me and say, why are you planning to kill every 10th child? There's an automatic assumption that the worst possible interpretation is the one the government is trying to put forward.
Right, but you are going to look at changing the wording.
Of course, we'll look at the Lords. I mean, the Lords have spoken. There's been a big majority last night. Of course, we've got to look at that as part of the democratic process.
Will that satisfy you?
Yes, they do. They need to look at it again. And, well, not look at it again, they need to change it. They need to get rid of these silly words, annoyance and nuisance. We want to have a society in which people have the right to be annoying and nuisance.
Yes, I agree with that. I absolutely agree with that. There's no dispute about that.
Then you've really got to change the words.
Well, I don't think it does what you think it does. But we are agreed that people should, in society, be allowed to be awkward and cause a nuisance in the sense of exercising democratic rights. Morris men, some people don't like Morris men in the street. No one's thinking about banning Morris men.
Well, no, you may not be, but others might be. I mean, the thing is, as a Liberal Democrat, particularly Norman Baker, there'll be many who will say, don't you feel uncomfortable about championing legislation around this sort of framework? Yes, people, of course, antisocial behaviour was a big, big problem, and no one doubts that something should be looked at. But as a Liberal Democrat, are you comfortable championing this sort of legislation in this way?
I'm comfortable because I don't think it does what the opponents of the bill or the opponents of the clause says it does. And if it did say that, I wouldn't be supporting it. But I'm very happy to look again at the wording. We'll see what the Lords have said. I'll analyse it in detail. I'll talk to my colleagues in the Lords and we'll come back. But there is no intention from the government, either side of the government, as a matter of fact, to do anything to limit people's civil liberties. What this is about is stopping antisocial behaviour.